Thank you. Well, I think you're all here because you know I'm going to show how what David Cowan called cut mark leys are part of the same energy feature that Guy Underwood called aquastats. I've streamlined this as best I can, but I may just go over the hour. And just to be clear from the get-go, I'm not making any comment about the cut marks themselves, just the spiral of energy that emits from them, and that David Cowan followed for thousands of miles. I'm just going to share my screen now, so there'll be a pause. Are you getting that?
It's coming.
Right.
It took a
Are we
minute or
there?
so. No, not yet. We'll just have to be patient. It's coming. There you are.
Yeah, are we in? Okay,
Yeah,
good.
you're onto the first page.
Thank you. And I'm a little concerned that I'm not going to do full justice to the extraordinary work of David Cowan, because I'm only selecting the parts which relate to his cut mark leys, and with a view to comparing them to Guy Underwood's geodetic system, especially aquastats. He did much more than what I'm telling you about, and I should say, so that you can make up your own mind, that he often mentions the Highland boundary fault and volcanic plugs. That's one aspect that I'm not going to go into in this presentation. My themes are water, cavities, and death and burial. A lot of my information has come from this book, get my cursor in the right place, Ley Lines and Earth Energies. And he's also produced a series of YouTubes, and he turned 88 last September. Guy Underwood's book, The Pattern of the Past, was published posthumously in 1969. And at the time of his research in the 1940s and 50s, most dowsers were water dowsers or water locators. And here was Guy Underwood talking about an earth force and how some of the features that he doused were accorded special religious significance, and how underground water had a connection with the siting of ancient monuments, and the widespread importance of serpent symbolism and spirals in prehistoric religions. He was ridiculed in his time and chose not to publish in his lifetime. The downside of that was that of the 7 manuscripts, it seems that the wrong one got published, mistakes and all. And I think that's a great shame, because his research is painstakingly detailed and cutting edge. And it's been my bread and butter since I began dowsing, or more or less since I began dowsing in 2017, as long as I'm aware what his mistakes are. His notes and manuscripts were passed to Dennis Wheatley, who meticulously investigated Guy Underwood's observations, and some of the main features are in Dennis Wheatley's book, The Essential Dowsing Guide. His daughter, Maria Wheatley, grew up alongside all these dowsing quests, and she too has investigated and expanded upon the work of Guy Underwood, both in divining ancient sites and in her newest book, The Secrets of Stonehenge. In this latest book, she includes some previously unpublished work of Guy Underwood using the manuscripts that were passed to her. I'm going to start with the exploits of David Cowan, and I'll say more about what an aquastat is when I get to the Guy Underwood bit. I'll be using the word aquastat a few times before then, if you could just bear with me. I'm also going to share some of the outcomes of my own dowsing quests. I'm very lucky to have the friendship of Maeve Calvert in any case, and in this particular instance for the input that she has had in reaching the conclusion to this presentation. Right, David lives in Creath here in Perthshire, and he calculates that he walked well in excess of 8,000 miles during his research as a whole. However, with just the circuits of cut-marked leys that form the basis of this particular bit of research, he says that he walked over 3,000 miles, some in winter. Just while we're on this slide, it'd be a good idea for a slide in a moment, if you could just get your bearings. So we've got Creath here. The cut-marked stone that he took the cut-marked leys emanating from is in the middle of this dumbbell-shaped circuit here. We've got a feature, a man-made feature called the Druid's Cave there. And could you just notice that that's Loch Tay, and there's a mountain called I think it's called Ben Lowers. I haven't heard it pronounced there. There's a map in a moment that doesn't have all those labels on. So notice how this circuit, or how this route, is shaped like dumbbells. He took a wave of energy emanating from a cup mark and followed it. He found that it eventually returned to where it started, forming a circuit. He then did that repeatedly, but with waves coming from different cup marks on the same stone. And he found that the circuits differed, but more or less layered, like shells around the same shape. Right, this is only part of the landscape that David walked in, and it's not particularly representative because it's quite flat. He followed these cut marks uphill and downhill and writes that he was nearly crippled by all the walking. When I asked him about that, he said he had a severe case of plantar fasciitis, which is an inflammation of the part of the foot that connects the heel and the toe. He said it's because he was walking uphill on his toes and downhill on his heels. And when he got home from work, he just padded around the house on his hands and knees. By way of setting the scene and to illustrate the distance and the scale of the undertaking, right, this slide is from Google Maps, and it indicates the distance and the time. So we were looking at Creath, his home there, and there's Loch Tay, and we were looking at Ben Lowers there. So if he used Google Maps to get from Creath to the Ben Lowers car park, it would take him 12 hours and 11 minutes walking, and that's just there. He then walked back and then did the same kind of circuit several times. And note that Google says that walking directions may not always reflect real world conditions. David writes a number of one-liners to describe some of the conditions he was out in walking in winter. For instance, he developed a manner of holding his rods with the tips pointing sharply downwards that he says was useful in adverse weather conditions like high winds. He writes that sometimes he used rods with no difficulty at all in winds which literally snatched the breath out of my mouth and drove me to seek shelter behind the nearest rock or wall. Another time, bitter wind and snow scudding horizontally across the hill forbade me to do anything else but walk to keep warm. On another occasion, the wind was so strong that it picked up a ram and blew it onto the branch of a tree where it dangled helplessly, unable to move. And on another occasion, weak and exhausted, he tripped and tumbled headfirst into a tussock of grass. He felt himself losing consciousness and struggled to his feet to keep going, knowing that lying even for a few minutes was dangerous. He's done his homework. This is the Druid's Cave, that we saw on the map earlier. It's a man-made megalithic cavity, and it's central. It's central to David Cowan's cut mark leys because he has taught to me that they're attracted to cavities. This is for, we've got that photo there, that's a shieling, which is the name given to a sort of a rough rectangular house or small holding. That's the Druid's Cave in the distance. That's it close up, and that's inside. And this is the Connaughton Farm cut mark stone. And this was the starting point for all the thousands of miles that David walked, following the energy that he found spiralling out of cut marks. It's these two cut marks that he notes are of a similar shape to the dumbbell-shaped circuits that he walked. And later in his research, he walked the cut mark leys that emanated from some of the other cut marks on this stone. And David's discoveries have earned him a place in Rory Duff's classification here. And Rory Duff says that they're electromagnetic. Right, if we start with the left-hand map, David found a relationship between death and burial grounds and his cut mark leys. He writes that the cut mark energy had been used and deliberately focused through the dead and these prehistoric burial grounds. And we'll talk about dead animals and birds a bit later. David realised that artificial mounds were also part of the circuitry and were responsible for directing cut mark leys over a wide area of Scotland and northern England. And I wonder whether these artificial mounds were hollow or contained cavities. The right-hand map shows how these cut mark leys are attracted to bodies of water, including puddles, but not if they were frozen solid. And that caught my attention. In the Guy Underwood bit a bit later, I'll say more about the connection between water and aquastats. For my central themes, we've got cavities, the Druid's Cave, burials and death, and also water. And because water is of fundamental importance, for the next 3 slides, we're going to look at it more closely, although it's still just a shallow dive. Oh, just before I move on, so you can see here how these shells, or how his routes that he's plotting, taking a different cut mark ley from a different cut mark in that same stone, they're sort of layering up in the same kind of shape. Right. Earlier in 2024, when I'd had the thought about David Cowan's cut mark leys being the same as Guy Underwood's aquastats, there were lots of dots I had to join up, and I didn't know whether they could be. But from the get-go, I've been encouraged by spirit allies, and the first shove of encouragement was in early April last year. And the main impetus behind this encouragement was along the lines of furthering the understanding of water, how water is part of the Earth's cleansing system, how underground water manifests as earth energies on the Earth's surface, and how water connects with all things to manifest a net of interconnectedness and is interdimensional. I think you have to agree that there is something about water, and we've already mentioned the sighting of ancient monuments upon it. You'll have no doubt twigged that this balloon has been rubbed on somebody's jumper to produce static electricity that the water is attracted to. and flowing underground water produces electricity, and that in turn produces the surface pattern that's dowsable. Down here at the bottom, John Baker explains the fourth phase of water, and that's based on the work of Dr. Gerald Pollock and his team at Washington University. Maria Wheatley describes his work in her Divining Ancient Sites book. And what I find astonishing, and others find astonishing, is that water contains both matter and light. For those of you who aren't familiar with the work of Vida Austin, her starting point was the work of Masaru Emoto, and she's developed a freezing technique that captures the artistry and information encoded in water during its transitional state between liquid and ice. She influences music with a picture, a word, music, or a thought, and then uses her freezing technique to capture how the water responds in an intelligent and repeatable way. She has over 53,000 photos of outcomes and is a friend of Gerald Pollock, who's a great supporter of her work. This photo is in her new book, and it shows light emanating from the formative ice. I'm not a scientist, but I can quote what they say. And the quantum physicist Kenneth Schmidt says this of photons, and I'm taking light to be energy comprised of small particles called photons. He says the birth of quantum physics brought science and spirituality into alignment. It was the realization by physicists that photons have consciousness, and not just limited consciousness, but awareness of the entire cosmos. And now we see that water contains light and consciousness. Science now says that there is more water in the earth than in all the world's oceans on the surface, and that it's held within rocks. There's definitely something about water. And I'll just let this slide speak for itself. There are various quotations taken from Vida Austin's talk in Exeter in 2024. Vida is accepted in the water science community and has spoken at the Water Conference in Germany and in Portugal, and is now doing a PhD on her topic. Right, so back to David Cowan's cut-mark leys, and he describes following a wave, one of the waves that emanates from a cut-mark stone. And he, this slide, or this one here, is showing that although the wave has a vertical amplitude, or down here, get my cursor in the right place, although the wave has a vertical amplitude, it actually douses in 2D as side to side. And I was heartened that both David and I arrived at this conclusion independently. What's actually a vertical wave douses as a 2D side to side wave for me too, in cut-mark leys for David and aquastats for me. And this is Fingal's Cave on the island of Straffa. And it may be that there are some of you here who are familiar with David Cowan's work and will know that this is actually taken from a YouTube about what David Cowan calls a traditional straight ley. But I think you have to agree that Fingal's Cave is a magnificent cavity, and aquastats or cut mark leys would also be flowing on it and would look like that. I'm just going to have a drink. This is, I think it's fair to say that in dowsing you really only understand something when you find it yourself. And this is a slide that I used a few years ago when I did a presentation on my research into octagonal structures. The War Memorial in Sidmouth Churchyard in Devon is octagonal, by which I mean it's a shaft with 8 faces. And I found that at 4 of the faces, an aquastat flowing with a water line, they're called holy lines, arrives, and at the other 4 faces, these holy lines depart. And look, a few years ago, I drew these aquastats as sinuous. They flow out of the porch here, and then this one's going into a church window, and that one's flowing out of a church window. And as I recall, that was the first time that I picked up aquastats as being sinuous. So getting back to cut mark leys, in all the thousands of miles of following them on foot, he noted these consistent features. That they follow the contours of hills, they don't go up and down, they seek cavities, either cut mark stones or bigger cavities like Druid's Cave or Fingal's Cave. And they have a sympathetic resonance to objects and thoughts. So dead birds and animals, what David Cowan noted, he was walking in spring, several springs, because this research went on over years. Walking in spring after a hard winter, he noticed that the cut mark ley would deviate from its course to flow through a dead bird or a dead deer. And sometimes the change of course was an abrupt 90 degrees. David is of the firm belief that it's the cavities in these carcasses that attracted the cut mark leys to them. He also noticed on one occasion that the cut mark ley abruptly changed course to flow uphill through a series of boulders with iron spikes driven into them. He writes that there had been a stone wall with a wire along the top held in place by these iron spikes, but an avalanche had destroyed the wall and scattered the stones. The cut mark ley had picked up one of these iron spikes on its normal route and thereafter seemed to seek out all the others before returning back to its previous route. And David writes that the same thing happened when he came across a clump of tree stumps. And thinking of dead people, he was walking along, it obviously wasn't winter, following a cut mark ley quite easily now, and he was well accustomed to it and thinking of other things. Then he noticed that the wavelength suddenly shortened, and he wondered why. When he retraced his steps, he found only the long, sinuous wavelength that seemed to be a feature of travelling across open country. Eventually, he realised that he had been thinking of a friend who died at the time when the wavelength decreased, and that happened on repeated occasions. That was one of the things that I had to find out about when I committed myself to doing this talk. I hadn't come across that with aquastats, and I have since tried it with aquastats, and the same thing happens. The undulations become much shorter and tighter. The cut mark ley and aquastat both respond to the dowser thinking about dead people. And I don't think Vader Austin would have a problem with that. They tune into lots and small bodies of water. We've seen that. And they seek the easiest route, devoid of objects if possible. Guy Underwood said that the path of aquastats must not be obstructed. And their shell is comprised of a single wave spiralling out of a powerful cut-marked stone, and the outer working edge is where the waves are closer together and where ancient sites are located. This idea of a working edge bothered me for a while. I hadn't come across it in aquastats, and it was one of the things that I needed to resolve. David is consistent that it's the waves on the left-hand side of the flow that are more spaced out than on the right, and it's the right-hand side that's the working edge. And that's what he means. So the cut mark ley would be approaching from, it's my right, I hope it's your right. And he hasn't drawn in the undulations, as he says here, or the wave effect. It's not shown for clarity, but you can see that the waves are more spaced out on the left-hand side, and this would be what he calls the working edge. And he says that these waves are especially attracted to a recent grave. And that happened time after time after time. It's the new graves that they seem to be attracted to most. David has done a lot of research into what he calls unhealthy lines from burial grounds are cleansed. And he calls these grave spirals spirit lines. And I'm not going to get diverted now about what that might mean. But here would be one of what he's calling an unhealthy line, and it's interacting with a white healthy line to be taken away and cleansed. And I bet that white line is an aquastat. And here we've got an Irish round tower. He says there are 2 in Scotland and that perform the cleansing function. The steps of them are at first floor level, and the base was filled with diamagnetic material. And he mentions how they're beneficial for agriculture and says how they seem to be near burial grounds for cleansing. This is more ruins of ancient shielings, simple rectangular stone dwellings. And David describes on several occasions that he came across them when he was following a wave of the cut mark ley. He describes once following one of the waves from a cut mark stone some distance away. It doesn't look like it's some distance away, it's here. Just how the drawings had to be for visual effect. The cut mark stone was some distance away, and he followed the cut mark ley across country, following the river turret, and then an unexpected right-hand turn to completely surround one of these shielings with a bifurcated bubble of energy, and so on, again and again. These cut mark leys, Guy Underwood writes about rivers commonly being aligned upon parallel aquastats. In this cut mark ley that encircles the dwellings, David did some research on how this bubble of energy could give inhabitants good health and a feeling of well-being. and how these encircling healthy energy waves eliminated unhealthy earth energies from the dwellings. And he has carved his own stones to deal with geopathic stress affecting some of the homes that he'd been contacted to help with. And he comments how our ancestors manipulated the flow of these cut mark leys for their own benefit. And as these healthy cut mark leys emit from a stone that has been deliberately carved by human hand, I agree that in this instance, this is the case. But they're just like the aquastat that I found encircling my house last summer, and I didn't do it. I live on the 1990s housing estate in Devon, and the aquastat surrounding my house emerges halfway up the staircase from the understairs cupboard, a cavity. It goes up my stairs. I live in a house where the bedrooms are downstairs, so the landing is actually a hallway. So it goes up the stairs, onto the landing, out the glass door, through the cherry tree, and round the rectangular plot that my house and garden are on. And this is the churchyard where St. Fillan is buried. It's at Dundurn Church. And David notes that the churchyard is circular, and Maria Wheatley points out that an ancient circular churchyard denotes a geospiral emitting from a blind spring within the churchyard, and that the churchyard walls mark the primary halo surrounding that spring. And this here is the hold stone that marks St. Fillan's grave. And from here, there's one flow that encircles the remains of the church, and another flow that enters the ruins of the church through the doorway and out through the window, and then back to the hold grave marker stone. And that's very similar to the aquastat that comes through my living room window. It's the same aquastat that encircles my house, that emerges from the understairs cupboard through the staircase. My house is built partially into a hillside, so I suppose you could call my understairs cupboard underground. I was curious whether the aquastat was entering my living room for its benefit or for mine. Well, it's coming in 5 out of 10 cleansed, 10 out of 10 energized, and it's leaving 9 out of 10 cleansed and 11 out of 10 energized. So either one would have been good for the aquastat's benefit or for my benefit, but I'm delighted that the aquastat is attracted to come into my living room for its own benefit. The polarity varies. This is what it was at the time that I measured it. Well, I've begun using the aquastat word now, so we'll move on to Guy Underwood's work and his geodetic system. I mentioned at the start that the wrong manuscript of Guy Underwood had been published in Pattern of the Past. So we got criticism in his lifetime and posthumously, but I consider a commendation by Billy Gaughan an accolade indeed. The point to be clear on is that the geodetic system is distinct and different from Hamish Miller's dragons and serpents, David's tubes, and Rory Duff's type 3s and type 4s, energy lines and type 5s. We're not dealing with a flow that has bands, which is what most dowsers who dowse in 2D find on the ground. We're talking hairlines and triads. A hairline is the name given to each of these single strands, and they're of no appreciable width, maybe half a finger width. And they clump in groups of threes, which is called a triad. And it's these flows made up of hairlines and triads that comprise the geodetic system. Guy Underwood described 3 different types of geodetic lines. Water lines, which, this one here, which a single triad, but you can get multiples, double or triple. And then track lines, a pair of triads like that, and also come in multiples. And then aquastat is 2 pairs with a larger gap in the middle and also come in multiples. It's these hairlines and triads that I found over the years tend to make people's eyes glaze over, but I have to mention it because it's the hairline and triad nature of aquastats that early on made me equate it with David Cowan's waves across the landscape, with the fine like the fine lines in Guy Underwood's aquastats. And all these geodetic lines have parallels, and especially when you take them into account. Well, water lines, we know that their parallels are circular, but for track lines and aquastats, if each of these have 2 to 5 sets of parallels or shadow lines beside them, that's a wide area of energy, a wide energy field comprised of thin lines flowing across the landscape. As our research has turned out, it's not quite as simple as that. And I'll come to how David Cowan's cutmark leys and David Cowan's aquastats marry up later on. I have quite a bit to say about aquastats, so I'm just changing the image to something a bit more soothing. This is a photograph that I took in 2018 when I was trying to find examples of all the geodetic features that Guy Underwood mentioned. It's actually in the far distance over there, barely visible. All these lines were heading across the field towards it. I actually ran out of blue markers for that bit there. It carried on in much the same way. And there are 2 springs at the top of this field. So what is an aquastat? Guy Underwood never said, and when Maria Wheatley researched it, she made the connection with deep underground primary water. Maria Wheatley calls primary water yin water because it's produced within the body of Gaia. Aquastats boost the immune system and promote longevity, and they have a harmonic and extremely beneficial energy field. She calls groundwater and aquifers yang water because it falls from farther sky. And many of you will be familiar with the non-beneficial effects that water lines can have on some people's health. Maria Wheatley was writing about Dr. Gerald Pollock's research into 4th phase water, H3O2, in 2014, and suggests that primary water, or yin water, is at least partly H3O2. It has been revered at holy wells as healing water and is often mixed with groundwater. Maria Wheatley has found that aquastats have 1 more negative ion and 1 less positive ion, and that they can be dry and the healing force continues to be emitted. She has found that when an aquastat and a water line flow together, and Guy Underwood called those holy lines, then the aquastat cleanses and transmutes the waterline of its toxic emissions. Guy Underwood describes an event during the Second World War when about 15,000 people took refuge in Chislehurst Caves in Kent, firstly as an air raid shelter, and then for many, somewhere to live permanently if they'd been bombed out. In 1959 and 1960, it was widely reported on the radio that many elderly people had been miraculously cured of their rheumatism during their time in the caves. Chislehurst Caves are over 20 miles of underground galleries, thought to be prehistoric and some man-made, and are aligned upon aquastats that created a healing environment. And of course, Chislehurst Caves are cavities. And so, in a presentation to the Earth Energies Group, we come to the issue of whether an aquastat is a water line or an energy line. We saw earlier what John Baker had to say about water producing electromagnetism and being attracted to electricity. And of all the references that there are about water and electricity and water and magnetism and electromagnetism, I'll just share what Freddie Silver said on a YouTube. He comments that the NASA website says, wherever we find veins of magnetism flowing across the Earth, underground we find streams of water. Flowing water attracts magnetism. And David Cowan himself noted the water and energy connection when he carved his cut-mark stones to place near a home that he was working on to heal it. He said that when carving the stone, place it above an underground pipe filled with water. The energy will turn and follow the water pipe downhill, using it as a carrier wave. So for me, anyone wanting to decide once and for all whether an aquastat is a yang water line for primary water or an energy line is on a hiding to nothing. The two go together. How can it be only one of them? It's water energy. Dennis Wheatley extensively studied Guy Underwood's notes and tested his conclusions. He found that knowledge of the geodetic system is known and applied by keepers of the ancient wisdoms, in a similar way to David Cowan saying that cut-mark leys were manipulated by the placement of burial grounds and ancient mounds. These photos over here show how churches can be built to accommodate aquastats. The windows could have been built anywhere that was wanted to admit sufficient light, but they are placed where aquastats enter and leave the church building to provide an easier route for them. You'll remember that David Cowan said that his cut-mark leys seek the easiest route, which had often been deliberately focused with man-made constructions. And I was looking at Maria Wheatley's programme for 2025 and her description of her tour to Malta. And this here is a porthole at the Temple of Manidra. And this is taken from her tour description. Portholes allow the free flow of energy within and without of the site. In the British Isles, these are known by geodetic dowsers as spirit holes, and some old medieval churches incorporated them at ground level, following the traditions of their pagan predecessors. And here is an example of that. This is an air brick at ground level. It's a church in mid-Devon, but I've seen them at lots of old churches. And the church restorers have obviously provided an easy passage for the transverse aquastats. I've seen them in many old stone walls in Devon and Cornwall too, for the aquastats to pass through. And oh, I should say, I don't know if you're surprised, but it's just normal for the aquastats to rise up and fly, fly through them above ground level. And then this is Trevethy Point on Bodmin Moor in Cornwall. And this is what Guy Underwood called the holy line, an aquastat and a water line flowing together. And they separated to flow through each of these holes. The aquastat component there and the water line at the other hole. In my formative years of dowsing, I made a study of the geodetic system at Down St Mary Church in mid-Devon. It was built into an ancient mound, and the churchyard is still slightly terraced. That's what these green lines are here. I think is there one further up? I've got 5 of you on the right-hand screen, so I can't see the right-hand side. At the bottom of each of these terraces, a holy line is flowing, and it flows through these air bricks there into the church wall. That's the close-up that we were just looking at. And these air bricks were there was a vicar in the know who restored the church in the 1870s and put the air bricks there for the aquastats to get through. In this case, the North Aisle aquastat, or the North Aisle is aligned upon the aquastat, and it enters through another, what I called a fancy air brick there, and flows through the building. And the aquastats in the graveyard section, many of them are aligned upon rows of graves. And so enter the cup marks. The left-hand image shows Guy Underwood's drawing of the carvings on the slaughter stone at Stonehenge. So we've got entry points here. That's what all the entry points for the aquastats, and then the actual carvings. And then on the right-hand diagram, it shows that the flows of the aquastats entering the stone there, here and here, and then flowing in a spiral fashion from and into the carvings or cut marks. And you'll find all manner of stone basins and hand-carved cavities in rocks with aquastat energy entering or emerging from them. You may find that it identifies as aquastat energy and not aquastat. I just wonder whether it's still forming. So I've outlined David Cowan's work and Guy Underwood's work, and now in this section, it's about my dowsing quests with a lot of help from my friends. I had a little adventure here, and while we're on this picture, just look at all the cavities and crevices and all the tors, all the tors on Dartmoor. All Dartmoor tors are granite outcrops, and Guy Underwood comments that many of Dartmoor's tors have blind springs at the summit. I stopped off here on my way north of Dartmoor one day, and I knew that I had spirit guides with me, so I just assumed that I had a task to do here. And it had doused as beneficial for me to stop off here. So I parked up, climbed out of the sunken car park, and asked for the most beneficial energy feature for me to be shown now, thinking that at least I'd be taken over to the rocks. But no, it was right where I was standing, barely a minor shuffle forwards. And it was a holy line. I was surprised to find that the energy feature that I was being shown was a holy line. That's the aquastat component and the water line flowing together in a holy line. But I did think it was wonderful that they knew that I was going to do this talk and were helping me with it. The holy line entered this crevice on this little rock, which struck me as curious. Not the flying holy line, that's normal, but the fact that the rock was so small. And I put my water bottle there for scale. I counted the hairlines and the triads and the spacing between them to see what had happened as a result of passing through the rock. I hadn't gone any distance. That's the roof of my van in the car park there. And I noticed that the lines on the left-hand side were increasingly spaced out, just as David Cowan says about cut-mark leys. And he calls this inner edge here the working edge, like we saw at the burial ground earlier. I hadn't come across this in aquastats before, and here I was being shown what I needed, and I find them like that all the time now. I thought I ought to see where this holy line went, given all the crevices we were admiring in Bone Hill rocks. Any inaccuracies are purely down to my drawing abilities, but this holy line flowed a few meters further on, didn't get near the rocks, and it just flowed into a spiral or a vortex and split and went its separate ways. Well, the aquastat part did. The waterline component just seemed to rebound off the outer coil of the spiral, of the aquastat spiral, without so much as a water spiral. And that struck me as odd. I hadn't seen anything like that before. And it seemed to me it was deconstructing before my eyes. And hang on a minute. An energy feature that's right there where I'm standing when I ask for it, and a holy line of all things flowing past a scrape of a car park on Dartmoor, flowing into a dinky little rock and emerging threefold and then deconstructing. Has this been put here for me? Yes, yes. I don't know about you, but if I'm shown something by spirit, I take it as information from the highest and purest authority. They knew I was doing this talk, and I'd been given help with David Cowan's working edge and the wider spacing on the left-hand side. So last June, it was Adrian Incledon Webber's weekend, and in the evenings, Kate Smart and myself spent our time dousing in the inner circle. And we investigated this zigzag line that Kate knew about, and we found it was an aquastat. It also identified as what David Cowan would call a cut-mark ley. They always do when I ask. It seemed quite communicative, and at that stage I hadn't quite worked out this water line or energy line issue. So I asked it how it liked to be thought of. After several no's, it did like being thought of as a water serpent, and anyone with an interest in symbolism would interpret that as water energy. His head and his tail were the same, and we followed him over the embankment here to see where he began or ended, into the ground over here. But as I followed it up the embankment, the zigzag became longer and more like elongated hairpins, and I knew what was happening. It was following the contours, taking the easiest route uphill, just like David Cowan had said of cut-mark leys. The other head or tail is to the rear of the chapel. Right, and here is that embankment. And I know it's not conclusive proof, but I thought it was curious that David Cowan also used the term serpent for the cut-marked leys that he walked. So the other end of the zigzag is behind the chapel in the Peace Garden, and you can imagine my delight to find it spiralling into the little hole in the manhole cover, or into the cavity. I had a morning at the Hurlers, which is a triple stone circle complex on Bodmin Moor in Cornwall. And one of all the features there are to douse there, I thought I'd just give myself some time out. I was intending to ask for a healing stone or a healing vortex, and I was standing here outside the middle circle, and I was just getting my rods out to do my permissions, and no sooner were they in my hand than they directed me down here where the photograph has been taken. I love it when that happens. It's like the spirit of place is saying, yeah, we know who you are. Come over here, got something to show you. So when I arrived, as I approached the area, I picked up the telltale wiggle of an aquastat. And I thought, oh, that's nice, an aquastat. I wonder what they've got in mind to help me with this presentation. And it was a vortex. Guy Underwood called them geospirals. And actually it had been in the back of my mind that I really ought to follow up on some of Maeve's extensive work that she's done into vortexes. And she concluded that clockwise spirals energize, anti-clockwise cleanse. Well, here's a vortex. What are you waiting for, Ali? The vortex was just above head height on me. Actually, Guy Underwood would call this a left-hand spiral because he's approaching it from the point of view of the aquastat. But I'm just using sort of the common currency of clockwise from the centre. And the drawing is quite reductionist. I've only drawn the whole aquastats. I haven't included the fact that they're four triads and the hairlines. I haven't included that at all, and that would give you a much wider area of lines. So here's the double aquastat approaching the vortex. I just threw in wellness to see what happened. And it travels into the clockwise, left-handed, but obviously it's a clockwise vortex. And another aquastat is joining it in the vortex, and it leaves as a single triple aquastat. It arrives 5 out of 10 energized, 6 out of 10 energized, but leaves completely energized, 10 out of 10. I did ask how cleansed it was as it left this clockwise vortex, but all I got was an anti-clockwise spin on my rods, which I interpreted at the time as, I know, it's where I'm going now. Right, so here's the triple aquastat approaching the anti-clockwise vortex, a three configuration aquastat. And it was only, say, 20 meters away, and I can only guess why it's gone so quickly from 10 out of 10 well to 5 out of 10 well. And it did consent to tell me how cleansed it was, and it was 5 out of 10. So after going deep into the earth to be cleansed by deep water, it leaves the geospiral as 2 aquastats again, cleansed and cleansed and well. But I suppose I can only guess as much as you can I suppose it's lost a bit of energy and being used in going deep into the earth through the vortex. For a while before I'd had this experience, I've been thinking about David Cowan's cut mark leys and how they abruptly alter course to flow through a dead bird or a dead deer, and how they were most plentiful at new graves and burial grounds. David Cowan is of the firm view that the flow is attracted to the cavities in them, but I don't think that. I think that the aquastats and cut mark leys are attracted to flow through dead wildlife and new graves as part of their cleansing function, and that the same cleansing function applies to iron spikes being driven into boulders and the tree stumps that I mentioned earlier. So at the beginning of last year, I'd started off thinking how similar cut mark leys and aquastats were, and I had a few things that I couldn't match up. And I've managed to resolve most of them, but this puzzle still remains. So this is the grand finale. I usually find aquastats with my feet. Please show me when my foremost foot is on the leading edge of the next triad, something like that. And yet David Cowan's illustrations show aerial waves. I'm extremely lucky to have Maeve Calvert to talk such things over with. For those of you who don't know Maeve, she uses her hands to feel earth energies and so finds them in 3D, like David Sharman and others see them. And it was through talking with Maeve that I realised that these geodetic features have a height, about 18 inches for aquastats and 2 inches for waterlines over here. A few years ago, after Nigel introduced us, Maeve and I had an email exchange, which I think we both understood as me trying to teach Maeve about aquastats. Maeve had also just completed one of Maria Wheatley's courses, and so all this homework isn't just at my behest. And Maeve found more than I ever realised was there. For example, there on the track line, this moving infinity wave moving forwards, and between the hairlines of a track line and all sorts of other things that I had no answer to. On Maeve's lawn over here, while she was doing her Maria Wheatley homework, Maeve found that the halos around the water feature had a height, and that the height was graduated, creating a sort of a concave saucer shape. And here it is again in the waterline. Now I'm in Devon and Maeve's in Nottinghamshire, so we don't often get to be certain that we're dousing the same feature. So last May, we were both at the BSD Spring Symposium, so it seemed a good opportunity to find a geodetic line and see how each of us found it. This waterline had appeared with the 3 hairlines, leaving the labyrinth that Graham Gardner had made. And again, Maeve had found the saucer shape. And in this saucer shape was an ellipse. And she found these saucers and ellipses in aquastats too. I still had nothing, I hadn't come across anything like this in anything I'd found or read myself. And then it dawned on us that maybe these ellipses continued higher, and that was what David Cowan was finding. So last October, I went to Nottinghamshire and we resumed our research, and Maeve found that not only do these vertical ellipses stack up, but through the centre of them is an undulating single line or wavelength. We've come to call these ellipses, vertical rugby balls. And I find that the number of them vary. I think that maybe the perfect number is 7. I couldn't find them at first, and I had to ask differently. Something like, please show me the frequency of what Maeve finds as ellipses. And I began to find them, and now I just find that my rods go in and out around them when I raise my rods. But it's it's the horizontal line that we think is what David Cowan finds. So this is what we think is going on. The aquastat emerges from one of the caves at Cresswell Crags. A traditional aquastat component douses, and it's in a single configuration, 2 paired triads, about 18 inches high. So if here it is approaching Maeve as she's standing in its path and dousing it, you'll have to imagine that this entire length here is about 18 inches high, with the graduated height, the saucer shape at the top. And Maeve is here sensing the vertical rugby balls that are stacked above this aquastat. And through the centre of the rugby balls is David Cowan's wavelength. I know that opens up a whole new line of inquiry, but I'm going to leave it there. And I wonder if there are any comments or questions. I thought that maybe certainly to start with, I could keep the slides up in case you